So please welcome with me Caroline Mace.
Thank you, Rosalina, and thank you everybody for coming this afternoon during your lunch hours. We will appreciate it. Everybody's sitting on one side, a little bit strategic on everybody's part, so you can sneak out. But thank you again for being here. And as Rosalina mentioned, I'll be talking about the Freight Mobility Plan. Some of you have heard pieces of this presentation. But I think, some of the things that you might have not seen, is I pulled out some of the Houston-specific information that might be useful. And again, do you want to hold, Rosalina, you want to hold the questions till the end, or do you want to do the questions? Okay, okay. Yep. So essentially, the freight plan was adopted by our Transportation Commission this January, but this gives you kind of an idea of what the freight plan is. And it identifies the challenges specific to the freight industry. So that's what the freight plan is, and the reason we developed the freight plan was really to meet MAP 21 requirements, and that's essentially obsolete as of last December. So the plan I'm presenting here today meets MAP 21, but does not meet the new Transportation Reauthorization Called FAST Act. So again, just to give you kind of an overview. So in the freight plan development process, two of my consultant buddies that we went on this journey together for a very long time are here. Kim and Mark are here today. But the process was very intense, but also it was very, very comprehensive, whereby we had, a lot of stakeholder engagement. We had a lot of data that helped inform the process, and the results of what you see today is really a combination of stakeholder-driven process, but also very intensive and comprehensive data analysis process. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, I mentioned that we had a very extensive stakeholder engagement process. Really, the kind of the umbrella of our stakeholder engagement process was the Texas Freight Advisory Committee, which is the TxDOT. And that was a 24-member committee that was chaired by, Judge Emmett, from Houston. And, they were created back in early 2013 to help us specifically to develop the freight plan. So they were kind of the umbrella stakeholder committee that helped with the entire freight plan development process. During the freight plan development process, we also, held the Freight Leadership, Summit. And that was very well attended, and really what we were trying to do with that summit was to engage a broader audience besides just the Freight Advisory Committee. And then also we held 2 rounds of listening sessions, dialogue across the state. I think we came to Houston twice, we did it, the first year, 2013, was more just listening to what are the issues, what are the challenges, and then we went back in 2014 was to present them with preliminary recommendations and really get their feedback on what the challenges were, but also on what the recommended strategies were to address those issues. Several speaking engagements throughout. We also involved a lot of other stakeholders. As you see here, TxDOT districts, divisions were very instrumental. Federal partners, again, industry leaders and stakeholders were a big component of our stakeholder engagement process. And I just wanted to show you the Freight Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, or the umbrella stakeholder engagement committee. And you can see on the left-hand side is all the sectors that are represented on the Freight Advisory Committee. And again, we tried to reach a broad cross-section of the state, but also of the industry within the state. And in terms of now, just kind of turn on some of the nitty-gritty analysis and some of the considerations, things that took place while we were developing the freight plan. To understand freight, we had to look at several things. Several factors drive freight movement in Texas. Population growth, as most of you are aware, we have been one of the fastest growing states. Most of major metropolitan areas, including Houston, on top of one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country for the last several years, if not decades. NAFTA trade. Again, we hear a lot about border issues, but NAFTA, since it was established in 1992, trade between U.S. and Mexico has quadrupled. And why is this important to Texas? 60%, over 60% of all the trade between the U.S. and Mexico comes through the Texas land port of entry. We have about 28 land port of entries between the U.S. between Mexico and Texas. And so a lot of that trade comes through Texas-Mexico border. Industry growth. A huge component of our growth has also been industry. A lot of industries are moving to Texas, and we're seeing a lot of growth. We've been the #1 exporting state in over 13 consecutive years. So we kind of dwarf a lot of the other sectors, but also we have a lot of other, energy sector. There's another element that we've seen, although it's kind of, died down a little bit, but that's still a big component of what's fueling freight growth in the state. And then here too, I didn't mention seaports. Seaports are part of, a key component of the trade, the growth in trade. With Panama Canal slated to open fairly soon, we're going to see, additional freight comes through our seaports. So Houston being, a major one, and Galveston and Freeport that impacts this region are definitely going to be issues that we have to look to in the future. In terms of freight, transportation, and the economy, why is freight so important? And this slide is really kind of showing you all 2.7 million jobs directly job impacts directly related to freight. And as you can see, almost half of economic output of the statewide economy is related to freight transportation. So again, when we look at freight, we have to look at not just the transportation side, but also look at the economic impact as well. And you can see here, it breaks it down by the different modes, the major modes, within that move freight within the state. Then also I mentioned that we looked at challenges facing freight transportation or freight industry in the state, and here we have several buckets of some of the key issues, and we'll start with the congestion piece. We spend or waste at least the congestion cost about $1 billion to the freight industry, and I'll talk a little bit later, specifically to the Houston region, how much that is for the region. But things like systems operation safety, a major issue for us, especially when you're in an urban area. Incidents that that impacts the motoring public, but also the freight industry. Connectivity issues, I mentioned border, but one thing I want to underscore here is public awareness. One of the biggest challenges we heard or uncovered was that the lack of awareness of why freight is important, especially to the general public. Joe public doesn't like trucks. Why can't we just get rid of trucks? I don't want to drive to next to a truck, and they forget that when they go to a grocery store, they still buy Starbucks every morning, that it just did not appear. A truck delivered it there. That truck next to you is carrying the milk that you're going to be buying, or the latte you're going to be buying from Starbucks. So there's a disconnect between public understanding why the trucks or the trains, I hate that train, is so loud. They need to move the train tracks from my neighborhood, not understanding that those train tracks have been there for over 100 years, even before the homes were built. So again, that's an area that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of educating the public in terms of why freight is important. And here, I won't dwell on this, but I wanted to kind of just throw some numbers here. When you look at the implications of what's going to happen between 2014 and 2040 in terms of freight movement, so I won't dwell on this, but I want to highlight some of the things here. The biggest challenge is going to be on our highway system. Right now we have, over 500,000 daily truck trips, and we're projecting that to essentially double by 2040. So that means we're going to have more trucks on our roadways. So how do we address those moving forward? Will highway solutions alone be able to address those? Again, this is just kind of showing, the magnitude of the growth. Essentially we're saying freight is going to double, literally all modes, but again, the trucking side is going to, be growing essentially at a faster rate. And one of the reasons being that, literally every freight trip or every goods movement trip starts with a truck and ends with a truck. So that's why you see a lot of truck trips. In terms of congestion and freight volumes, there's two maps. One is showing freight volumes, the other one is showing congestion. And if you look at the red lines, They kind of mirror each other. You know, you see the red lines on the freight volumes, and you see the red lines on the congestion. So at some point, those merges and they collide and create some big challenges, especially for our urban areas. So you see most of our urban areas, including Houston, you know, the red is very prominent on both maps. So again, when you look at some of the numbers, we know 2.2 billion freight moving in 2040, and a bulk of that moving by truck. You know, so you start seeing that our highway congestion issues are not necessarily going to go away, but they'll probably be exacerbated. And then the next few slides, I wanted to give you guys kind of, you know, Houston perspective. Why is this region such a freight hub? And why do we see some of the challenges we see here? And this is just showing you, you know, these are imports. These are things that are coming through the Port of Houston, you know, that we're consuming, whether it's staying within this region or going throughout the United States. So again, you see that Houston plays a big role in imports. Exports, this is things that are coming from other parts of the country or within Texas coming to the Port of Houston and being shipped, you know, to international destinations. So again, a lot of, you know, that weight and cargo is coming through by rail, but bulk of it is coming by truck through the port. In terms of the ports, now looking at different ports within the state, you can see Port of Houston. They're drafting all the other ports. You see the bar, that tallest bar is Port of Houston. So again, but then you also look at other ports like Galveston and Freeport playing a key role in that. But the challenge in the Houston region is not just Port of Houston and Port of Freeport or Galveston. You look at, you know, all the Texas ports, you know, the ones on the south, all the way from Brownsville. If anything is going, you know, north, it generally is going to come through through Houston region to go up on I-69 or go to I-10. So again, you know, the impact of Houston is not just Port of Houston. We're looking at all the other ports as well. And in this slide, I wanted to show you, kind of give you a national impact of Port of Houston. And this is looking at truck movement from Port of Houston, you know, from day 1 to day 7. So just follow this with me. This is day 1. This is a truck that left Port of Houston day 1. That's how far they will go. Day 2, you see they start, you know, spreading further and further across the country. Day 3, they're almost in New York. Day 4, they're almost as far as, day 5, they're almost as far as Canada. So day 7, they're, you know, they are all over the United States. So this is, you know, what happened. You know, this is just taking 2,000 trucks leaving Port of Houston and tracking them for 7 days and just showing, you know, the impact, the national impact of the Port of Houston, and shows that, you know, everything that comes to Port of Houston doesn't stay here, it goes all over the United States. So when we think about Houston, you got to kind of think, for us, we take it as a statewide perspective, and then also look at a national perspective. So when we're looking at, you know, national significant issues and projects and corridors, we take some of this analysis into consideration. Kind of bringing it down a little bit to Houston in terms of the congestion issues. I kind of painted a picture of how much and where freight moves in Houston. Now we look at choke points or challenges. This is this graphics here, and the information is created by TTI. TTI every year helps TxDOT develop what they call the 100 most top congested corridors in Texas. And this one, they looked at just the trucking side of it. So, you know, identified all these corridors within the Houston region that essentially, you know, truck choke points in terms of hours of delay, hours of annual delay per truck, and the cost as well. So some of you are very familiar with these corridors. And then on the national level, this is done Federal Highway every year at the national level. They look at 250 most, you know, truck bottlenecks in the nation, and they come up with the top 25. So in 2014, the top 25, out of the top 25, 7 were in Texas. And of the 7, the ones I've highlighted in red here, 5 of those are in Houston. So again, a big choke point, big issues when it comes to bottlenecks and choke point for freight in the Houston region, you know, and nationally recognized. So some of the things that we're doing is looking at how can we address and mitigate those. Yes?
What's a freight bottleneck versus just a regular traffic bottleneck?
Pretty much the same, but these are the areas where we have the highest and heaviest, you know, delays for trucks. This is just looking at trucks. So this is taking at a national perspective, and they have this 250 areas or choke points, and they measure it by truck delays, etc., and they come up with that from a truck perspective. But if you overlay this on the passenger side, literally some of it will be the same, but some of it is varies, because what TTI does the passenger and they do the truck, and sometimes they're very different. Sometimes the truck is much higher and then the passenger is lower.
What is TxDOT?
Oh, Texas Transportation Institute. They're part of Texas A&M University. Yeah, they're more a research arm of Texas A&M. Sorry for the acronyms. And then I mentioned cost of congestion to the trucking industry. I mentioned that in 2013 the cost was $1 billion, but as you can see in Houston was ranked 6th in the nation, for the cost of congestion to the trucking industry. So again, you start looking at these numbers, and the trade industry pays attention to that, because when a truck is delayed in traffic congestion, it's costing that company, I think on average nationally, it's about $200 an hour when a truck is delayed in traffic congestion. So again, that's how they come up with some of these numbers. And then the next few slides, I'll turn it to the freight plan recommendations. Laid out kind of the issues and challenges, how we got to where we got to, and the issues and challenges. So the next thing is really the meat of the plan, which is the recommendations. And for the recommendations, we kind of grouped the recommendations in 3 buckets. One, we looked at policies. These are big picture recommendations on what are some of the things from a broader based perspective that we need to do to address freight issues. Then the second one was the programs, and the programs are much more, programmatic recommendations are things that, okay, what are some of the not necessarily very specific things we should do? For instance, identify the need to look at truck parking. Should we do a study on truck parking? Look at things like design standards. Do we need to develop a program that looks at design standards? So that's the level of the program recommendations. Then the projects are much more specific, where we're looking at, okay, I-10 from X to X. We're going to add a lane, or we're going to improve bridge or whatever. So those are the project specific recommendations. And here just kind of a graphic really just showing we had 21 policy recommendations as part of the freight plan, and here it outlines that, and I don't expect you to read that, but we do have that online. So one of the key policy recommendations that we put forth in the freight plan was a freight network, and this is very significant for Texas, but also with FAST Act. There's actually funding tied to the freight network. And for our purposes, we developed 2 sets of network. We have the primary network, which is any roadway in Texas, primarily interstates that move in excess of 50 million tons of freight. And then the secondary network, which is mostly US highways, state highways, and some other corridors that move less than 50 million pounds of freight a year. And why is this important? I think really the key is that, early on in the freight plan development process, we discussed the fact that we have limited resources. So how do we go about recommending having a manageable network, to target for freight movement? So that's how we got to this, and this helps in making decisions moving forward on, so that we can focus limited resources on the strategic network of where freight moves within the state. And then under FAST Act, the new transportation bill, the feds have come up with a national freight network. And that one, they actually have funding tied to it, so that Texas and all the other states around the country have apportionment or formula funds tied to that has to be spent on freight-specific projects. And we have to demonstrate that we have freight-specific projects that total our apportionment at the federal level, and it has to be on the National Freight Network. That's one requirement, but also it has to be on the freight plan. So the document I'm talking to you about today, is really, really important, because now it's helping us be able to draw down federal funds. If we didn't have the freight plan, the statewide freight plan, we would have not been able to draw down the federal funds. We would have essentially been losing $100 million a year that we could bring to Texas. Following on, there's some other recommendations. The need to review and modify design standards, and you might ask, what do I mean by that? Essentially, most of our designs, our roadways particularly, were designed with passenger vehicles in mind. They were never designed for trucks in mind. Things like bridge heights, interchanges, turning radii. When you drive on some of the city streets, you see trucks jumping over the curb and things like that. So that's where the design standards come in, whereby we're designing with trucks in mind, especially on our roadways. Then the other recommendation is we need to identify strategies to reduce rate of crashes and fatalities on our roadways, so improving safety, not just for the trucking industry, but also for the motoring public. Looking at developing and implementing, innovative technologies. Again, the freight industry as an industry uses a lot of technology, but on the public sector side, how can we keep up with that? You've heard a lot of things from connected vehicles to, freight shuttle, things like that. So that's kind of the technological piece that, we're looking at. And then, really the most critical one is how can we best align transportation investments with, the state's economic development vision or goals? Because essentially when it comes to investments in transportation, one of the key goals is, to facilitate businesses coming to Texas and retaining those businesses and allowing those businesses to expand. You heard recently Toyota, is moving to Plano. Again, there are several reasons there. One, they have a manufacturing plant in San Antonio, but also a lot of their parts come from Mexico. So again, strategically being located in Texas instead of locating in Missouri or other state is really important, because the transportation facilities we have here, including airports, railroads, the port being close by, the border being there, really makes a big decision for a lot of companies. And then on the operations side, there were several recommendations that we made to address operational issues. And one is really traffic management, developing a statewide traffic management center. I know in Houston, Transstar is a really, good benchmark when it comes to, providing information on incidents and also providing, information to the motoring public. But how can we best do that at a statewide level, corridor level, whereby we're addressing freight needs and freight issues? Recently, last week, we had to shut down I-10 because Louisiana had shut it down. How do we provide that information to the motoring public beyond, let's say Beaumont and Houston, but give them information as far as El Paso so they can make that informed decision? Other things we talked about or recommended here is, construction management, how we manage construction. A lot of times we do construction at night. But guess what? That's when the trucks move. That's the bulk of the trucks move at night. So when we shut down, lanes at night, we're impacting the freight industry more than we're impacting passengers. So being conscious about that. I talked a lot about, design standards, looking at, interchange reconstruction, making sure that our interchanges are conducive to modern-day truck operations. Bridge heights, I mentioned that as well, making sure that our bridges, trucks can operate on our bridges safely and efficiently. And finally, I talked about project recommendations. In the freight plan, we recommended over 1,200 projects. And these are multimodal projects. As you can see from the graphs, we have highway projects, we have rail projects, we have port, waterway-related projects, air cargo-related projects. Again, because freight moves by all those modes. Trucking seems to be the most dominant, but at the end of the day, rail, air, water, all of those provide, the movement for freight that we, generally have to look at. And the total estimated cost for the plan is $44.8 billion. That seems like a big number, but another big number is that we still have, about $25 million worth of needs that are not even reflected here. So yeah, so fairly staggering in terms of the needs for moving freight. And again, this numbers, for all the modes of moving freight. So where do we go from here that the freight plan now has been, adopted, developed, and meets MAP 21, as I mentioned earlier, that the plan does not meet FAST Act requirements. And the FAST Act, there's 3 components that we have to add to the plan. The first component is that we have to develop rural critical freight corridors, and then we also have to develop urban critical freight corridors, and then the plan has to be financially constrained. and the number I showed you, the 44.8 billion, is closely financially constrained. We had some projects in there that were not fully funded, but in the FAST Act, we have all the projects have to be fully funded, the projects that were put in the freight plan. So we're going to start updating the freight plan fairly soon, probably within the next few months, to make sure that we are FAST Act compliant, because we have to make sure the plan, as it stands by December of 2017, that is FAST Act compliant. Otherwise, we will not be able to draw on future funding from FAST Act. And then
What does FAST stand for?
FAST Act, fixing it. Yeah, thank you.
Fixing America's Surface Transportation.
Yeah, so it's a federal transportation bill, and that's the recent one that was passed in December, and it's a 5-year bill. So, and that's normally what we, including the TxDOT, state DOTs, including the MPOs, that's how a lot of our federal funds come into to what we do, essentially. That's what guides. And any transportation project that we implement is generally guided by the federal transportation bill. So I mentioned earlier that, under FAST Act, we have appropriation for Texas that's in the neighborhood of $100 million every year for the life of the FAST Act. So again, the projects, to qualify for the formula funding, the project has to be on the National Freight Network, but also the project has to be on the freight plan, the statewide freight plan. And then as part of FAST Act, they have a discretionary grant funding. This is a competitive grant funding, and it's nationwide, and it's about $800 million a year for the life of the FAST Act. And they have criteria for who can apply and what types of projects qualify for that. And then finally, we're going to continue with the Freight Advisory Committee, essentially, at least indefinitely, because we still have a lot of work to do. Judge Emmett made it very clear that he did not want the freight plan to sit on the shelf, and make sure that we implement the recommendations of the freight plan. So we'll look at continuing that committee. And that really concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. Yes.
Say $100 million a year in the FAST Act?
Yes, that's for sorry, that's the formula funds, or the appropriated funds for Texas. Any other questions? Well, again, I can't tell you a number right now. That will be dependent. We have several funding sources that are generally used to fund freight projects. We have Prop 1, Prop 7, and several other state and local funding sources that can be utilized besides the federal funds. So, when we do actually develop the constraint plan, we'll have to make sure that all of those funding sources have been identified for every single project. We can't have, a project that has, holes or doesn't have, it's not fully 100% fully funded in the plan. Yeah, but the $25 billion I talked about, those are needs. Those are needs that right now we don't even have projects identified, at all. Yeah. Yes.
Does the plan recommend, you mentioned Prop 1 and 7, those are for roadways only.
Mm-hmm.
Does the plan recommend other improvements on non-roadways? And if so, what's the breakdown, if you know?
The plan recommends, not just, highway-related projects. As you see here, we have rail, we have ports, waterways, air cargo, border-related projects. Those projects, for instance, rail and ports, they're privately, owned, operated. So a lot of the funding is privately, private funds from the ports or from the railroads. But we reflected that in the freight plan here because this is a multimodal freight plan. So we as TxDOT or the public sector doesn't necessarily have a say on how those are funded, but definitely the railroads and the ports and other entities, we have to all work collectively to make sure that one project doesn't, impact the other, or the lack of the other project doesn't impact something else. But when it comes to, identifying those fundings, we have no control over. As TxDOT, mostly we have control over the highway piece. Yes.
How does this jive with the Freight Mobility Plan's statement of $34 billion in primary priorities and then another $28 billion in secondary priorities? Because that's a total of 60 some odd as compared to the 44.
Yeah, well, it was kind of, when you talk about that, it was kind of in the math, in the math. So I'm not sure where, the primary, you mentioned primary priority, yeah, and secondary priority. No, we broke down the investments in the primary network versus investments in the secondary network. So it's not necessarily priority, but we did do priorities, of the different, priorities of investments, high, medium, and low.
But those add up to more than this, that's why I'm a little concerned. I don't understand. That's 62 compared to 44.
Well, I'll have to follow up with you on that. But I know that, the numbers we have here, add up to 44, but unless you're adding the 22 billion in there. Yeah, the 22 billion, the 25 billion, the 25 billion in needs. Yep.
So Caroline,
Yeah.
so the 44 billion, is that part of somebody's tip or long-range plan, essentially?
Yes, yeah. These are not new projects. These were all the projects that were programmed in the Unified Transportation Plan, which is, projects that pull from MPO tips, MPO long-range plans, our districts, and all the public sector entities that develop projects. So in the freight plan, there were no new projects. They had to be existing in some plan, in some fashion. Same with like the ports. The ports have a capital program. We pull projects from the capital program. And then, there are other several reports that we pull projects from because, again, we did not want to go and reinvent the wheel in terms of identifying those projects because also we wanted to make sure, especially in the short term, that we had projects there that can be implemented.
So this 44.8 is in the UTV?
Pretty much, with the exception of the, like some of the rail projects and port projects, et cetera. Because UTP is primarily a highway plan. Yes, sir.
I'm working with the local district on the H-GAC local centers plan. And one of the challenges they're having is on one street that they really want to improve the walkability of. There's a lot of freight that goes down that street and it really detracts for several reasons. And that it's a TxDOT roadway, so there's no local jurisdiction there to control freight. I was wondering two things. One, what tools does TxDOT use to govern where freight can go? And what's the process of a local jurisdiction engaging TxDOT to change that, to make it restrict or to send it another way, freight traffic?
Okay, yeah, I'll answer the first one. TxDOT doesn't have any rules that govern where freight can go or should go. Essentially, freight can go on any of our interstates, any of our state highways, any of our U.S. highways. Freight can go on those facilities. Truck routes, on the other hand, are developed by the local jurisdictions. The local jurisdictions are the ones that have, the autonomy on, what they dedicate as truck routes within the jurisdictions to say, okay, trucks you can't go here, trucks you need to go here. But if it's on a state route or a U.S. highway, they have to work with TxDOT, and TxDOT has to agree for them to limit truck traffic on a state highway or a U.S. highway. So that's kind of how that works. But in terms of, making it, a livable center, where there's a lot of freight, again, those are land use decisions that created those freight demand in those areas. So again, it goes back to the local agencies. If you have, a very freight intensive corridor with businesses and other activities that are generating freight, if you want to make it pedestrian, so you have to look at, how can you balance, livability as well as moving goods and economic development, because, some of those people that live there have the jobs that are being generated by this freight movement. So how do you design that? And there's examples around the country that, help with, doing freight-centric but also livable-centric examples of, where freight can coexist. Things like limiting hours when freight is delivered, but also, providing parking, in certain areas, designated parking for the trucks, et cetera. So there's ways that can be done, but, that's not really where TxDOT can come in, other than, working with the locals to address those issues. Yes?
TxDOT is a governmental entity. Rail is all private enterprise. What are you doing as an entity to try and work with rail to see the trade-offs on rail versus truck, desirability, investment, et cetera? Because the more that's on rail, the fewer on roadways, so to speak. Yeah. So how does that interface work?
Well, like I mentioned, on the Freight Advisory Committee, we have all the 3 Class 1 railroads in Texas that have been very involved, very engaged, and we've had great discussions with them. They were at the table from the get-go, and they understand the issues and challenges facing both the highway side but also on the rail side. So what we do working with the railroads is identifying issues like at-grade rail crossing to improve rail fluidity, whether it's eliminating or improving at-rail crossings so the trains could, operate safely and probably at a little bit of faster speeds. By looking at corridors, how can we, look at things like double stacking, and a lot of those is dealing with bridges. As you know, a lot of the rail crisscross with highway. So how can we, look at those choke points? One big example of private-public partnership was Tower 55 in the Fort Worth area, whereby TxDOT was involved, the cities and other entities were involved in that. It was, several billion-dollar project. It's still kind of ongoing now, that all the entities came together, because it was both a highway and a rail issue and a challenge for both. It was probably more for the rail than on the highway, but came together and found a solution to address that, and everybody kind of pitched in. So
this includes rail's 5-year plan, 10-year plan? What is this? How far out is the investment of rail included in your plan?
It's just till 2040. Yeah, 2040. We looked at projections till 2040. So everything from the rail and highway side is going till 2040. But that doesn't mean that the rails identified investments going to 2040. As you know, the railroads are fairly short term. So yeah, a lot of the projects don't go longer than 10 years, so even 5 years. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you anticipate this plan affecting the H-GAC region in terms of investments?
A lot. There'll be a lot of impact. Some of it happening already right now. About a month or so ago, our commissioner announced the Congestion Relief Initiative, and several of those projects are in the Houston area. And actually several of those projects benefit freight and they're on the freight plan. So you could see that impact already happening right now in terms of investments. I showed you the 7 most congested or freight bottlenecks. The Congestion Initiative was looking at how can we address those freight bottlenecks, which end up also being passenger bottlenecks or choke points. So you really see, how it's impacting the region, but also in terms of other projects that we have in the freight plan right now that are moving forward. Because of the emphasis on freight, that, things like Grand Parkway that is being developed and other projects being developed around the region, I-45, a lot of investments is being made on I-45, is because the freight plan highlighted that it's a critical freight corridor, especially at 45, moving freight between Houston and Dallas. So again, there's a lot of emphasis on that. We looked at track traffic on that corridor, so that, moved it up a little bit on, the priority list. So you see a lot of that happening right now. But a lot of things, before I came here, I was talking to our district on things that, they should be doing or moving forward, or some of the implications of the plan. We talked about, design standards, but also looking at different, how can they best identify freight projects and make sure that we're addressing, the needs in the region. So again, the plan created awareness, but also the plan came up with strategies that has to be implemented. And I mentioned that we're going to be implementing moving forward. One, updating the plan, but two, also implementing the plan. So we're going to be working with the MPOs, we're going to be working with the districts, and figure out where are things and what are things that they can move forward with, fairly in the short term, but also in the long term. What are some of the things that they can be doing locally to be able to move their piece of the freight plan, because we have MPO specific, for the Houston region, specific recommendations. Are there any gaps in those recommendations? I mentioned the needs that still exist. Can the MPO be looking at those needs and see what types of projects they need to put forth or strategies they need to put forth to address those needs?
What you see is the RTP for H-GAC is going to grow, because you have an example project would be direct connectors between Marvin and Boulevard and State Highway, which isn't even in the RTP right now. That's a $40 million project. So that's just one example. As we went through the Freight Mobility Plan, we identified a lot of needs that weren't even in the plan documents at this point. So as we go forward, we're going to see a lot of those start to get added to the RTP, and then eventually the 500. So there's still a lot of work left to use to get all the projects into the plan documents.
We'll let the district know how big that bill is. We get it all settled.
Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah, and that's fine. I think, one of the biggest challenges we had when we were developing the project list was that we were having a hard time really to assemble freight-centric projects. And because a lot of them, especially in the Houston region, were not in any plan, so moving forward, really, tightening the belt a little bit in the region and making sure that we have, a portfolio of freight-centric projects that benefit freight movement in this region that can be put forth in plans moving forward. Again, you got to do the planning before you can actually have projects that are funded. Yes?
So in the continuation of this effort, has there been any consideration of what is y'all's thought with regard to identifying perhaps not enough funding to get all these moving? Specifically, is you guys working on any way to measure the benefits of constructing Project A over Project B?
Yeah, we are definitely going to be doing that as part of FAST Act, and actually started with MAP 21. We have to do performance-based planning, and part of making the plan, financially constrained, we also have to make sure that those projects are vetted, the benefits of projects. So with the FAST Act grants, we have to do a benefit cost analysis for those projects. So you're probably going to see us carrying that forward. We're making sure that projects that we put in the freight plan or move forward, those projects that there's some analysis of looking at the benefits versus the cost of those projects for moving freight. So yes, we'll be looking at that.
So with the flooding that took place and shut down I-10, was freight rail impacted by that?
Freight rail, probably, but I'm not sure. I know I was involved in the highway shutting piece, so I knew about that and, help with the strategies of how we communicate with the trucking industry ahead of time, before we shut that. But I think if the rail bridge is a little bit higher than the highway bridge, so, on the I-10, so I didn't hear about the rail side. Yeah. But I know the highway side definitely, we had to shut down. Yeah.
So if a region identifies a freight-centric project is not in the current state mobility plan, freight, how
Yeah.
would they add it?
Well, one thing is we're going to be updating the freight plan starting the next few months. That will be opportunity for those projects to be added in. And then the plan moving forward is we're going to be updating the project list at least on an annual basis, so to allow for those projects. Projects will drop out, projects will come in, so it's going to be a very dynamic process. So we're not going to have a project list that sits for 5 years because the process changes very frequently. So we're going to do that every year to allow those projects to be pulled into the freight plan. Yeah, because again, that impacts moving forward. If we want to use any federal funds for those projects, we have to make sure that it's in the freight plan. So whether it's an MPO project or a TxDOT project or local project, if they want to use federal funds, we have to make sure that it's in the freight plan. Any other questions? No? Thank you again, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate your participation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and call. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah.